You'd think danger hides in dark alleys, not in the house across the street. But true neighbor horror proves otherwise. These are the stories that make your own walls feel suddenly unsafe. The hidden camera. Margaret had lived in a modest two-story home with her husband Benjamin for the better part of 20 years. All of their kids were out living their own lives, and she couldn't have been prouder. What she was about to tell happened last year. Someone had just moved into the house across the street, which was a relief because she had grown sick of looking out at a vacant house all the time. Margaret was retired, so she spent a lot of time on her front porch, knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with Benjamin, sometimes listening to true crime podcasts, other times just playing music. The person who moved into the house was a young guy, maybe mid-20s. He drove an expensive-looking BMW and always dressed in flashy clothing, so Margaret figured he was either well off or seriously pretending. She hoped she wasn't given the wrong impression about him, but he turned out to be really sweet. He introduced himself after a few days. His name was Quinn, and he was a few years out of college, just as she had guessed. Quinn was bright and got along really well with Benjamin. They laughed and talked about sports, and Benjamin even dropped a few of his own college stories Margaret hadn't heard in years. Quinn said he worked in the entertainment industry, doing freelance work for some internet personality, whatever that meant. It went over Margaret's head, but it must have been lucrative. He looked wealthy, like she had said. He talked about stocks with Benjamin and shared some of the investments he was making. All in all, he seemed like a nice guy. Things were normal for a few months. Since Margaret spent so much time on her porch, Quinn would often wave to her when leaving his house, and she always waved back. She couldn't remember exactly when, but she started noticing the same girl going over to Quinn's house every so often. The girl drove a little white convertible and was pretty young, blonde, the type of girl one would expect a guy like him to date. To be frank, she dressed a bit scandalously, which Margaret didn't fully appreciate. She figured the girl was Quinn's girlfriend, maybe checking on the house while he was out. The girl had her own house key, so it made sense. It became a regular thing. Once, maybe twice a week, Margaret would see that car roll up while Quinn was gone. The girl would go inside, stay for a while, then leave. Margaret didn't really understand what she was doing, but young people dated differently these days, so she kept her thoughts to herself. Then, one evening, she saw them together. Quinn pulled into his driveway with the girl in the passenger seat. That confirmed it. She was his girlfriend, just as Margaret had assumed. But shortly after that day, things started getting tense. At least, that's what it seemed like. One afternoon, Margaret was out tending to her little garden when she heard shouting from across the street. Quinn and the girl were standing in the driveway yelling at each other. She couldn't catch what they were arguing about, but she didn't need to. The girl kept throwing her hands in the air, practically spitting her words at him. It looked like she was going to strike him. Eventually, she got in the car, slammed the door, and tore off down the road. Quinn shook his head and went back inside. Margaret didn't even think he noticed her. She figured it was a lover's spat. Every couple fought, and it wasn't her place to butt in where she wasn't welcome. But then Margaret saw that girl's car in front of his house again when he wasn't home. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. She told Benjamin, and he said it was rude to pry and that she should just leave the poor boy alone, which she agreed with. But then came the night everything went sideways. Margaret and Benjamin were asleep when they woke up to sirens blaring outside. They rushed out, joining the handful of neighbors who had come to see what was going on. Quinn's house was swarming police cars, an ambulance, the whole nine. They watched as the cops emerged from his house with that girl in handcuffs. She didn't struggle or scream, just accepted what was going on and stared ahead with a blank expression. Quinn was rushed outside on a stretcher. He was a bloody mess, and Margaret gasped at the sight. They didn't see him for a week after that. Margaret was worried sick. When he finally came back, she and Benjamin walked over to check on him. Quinn let them in without hesitation and told them everything. Apparently, that girl her name was Ellie had confessed, which made things easy for the police. For starters, she wasn't supposed to have his house key. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without him knowing. According to Quinn, she started asking him for things. Fancy dinners, jewelry, expensive trips. When he hesitated, She got possessive and angry, and that's when things started going downhill. Every time she had shown up unannounced, he hadn't been aware. She had access to his location through his phone, which Margaret hadn't even known was possible. She had gone through all of his stuff, but worst of all, she had planted hidden cameras in his room. Every time she went back to his house when he wasn't there, she was replacing the camera batteries and making sure they were still working. The argument Margaret had overheard was Quinn's attempt at breaking up with her. She refused, and Quinn reluctantly agreed to go on a break. Ellie had seen everything through the cameras, and the next night, she went to his house with a knife. Margaret didn't want to imagine the rest. Somehow, Quinn managed to get her to the ground, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctor said he was an inch away from needing surgery or dying. Margaret and Benjamin tried to console him, but he was visibly shaken. The last thing he said before they left was that he had learned his lesson about flaunting his money, especially around pretty girls. He moved out not long after. He said he didn't feel safe in that house anymore, and that his ex had tons of friends just like her, and he didn't feel comfortable knowing they might have known where he lived. They never saw him again. Margaret prayed he was doing okay. No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not someone as young as him. At the foot of the bed. Garrett had been a sophomore in college when all of this happened. When he didn't get a dorm after freshman year, he scrambled for off-campus housing. Long story short, he ended up in a co-op, part of a three-house community that was sort of near campus, but not really. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and he didn't have many options. Plus, he had a bike, so he didn't really mind the extra travel time. Most of the residents were young students like him, but there were a few exceptions. There were a handful of alumni, one or two TAs, and a few older people getting their degrees later on in life. But the person who immediately stood out to Garrett was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses. From what he could tell, she was maybe in her late 50s, even though she looked a little older than that. She had graying hair and walked with a sort of limp, like she had some kind of back injury. She was really quiet and mostly kept to herself, and she always had this blank expression on her face. Garrett assumed she had some kind of connection to the university, maybe faculty or maybe an alumna, but no one explained and he didn't ask. The first time he saw her do something strange was in their common kitchen, which was a little weird to begin with because the two other houses had their own kitchen, so he wasn't sure why she'd be hanging out in theirs. She wasn't cooking or eating or even talking to anyone. She was just standing there while the rest of them were talking and running around, making dinner and listening to music. She didn't try to join in. She just watched them blankly. Garrett caught eyes with her a few times, and part of him got the feeling that she was watching him specifically, even though he knew that was unlikely. No one acknowledged her, which he thought was a little weird too. Maybe they knew something he didn't. Later that week, he was doing some homework in his room when he saw her again. He glanced out his bedroom window and there she was, staring up at him. As if that wasn't strange enough by itself, she wasn't even on the sidewalk, but rather in the middle of the street. It was getting late, and it was decently cold too, so she must have been freezing out there. He couldn't tell if she was looking into his window or just in the general direction of the house, but he felt like she was staring at him specifically. He didn't know why he did it, but he waved at her trying to be friendly. The moment he did, he instantly regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped up and down a few times, like she was excited, and then ran towards one of the other houses, presumably hers. Garrett felt kinda sick. Not only had he acknowledged her, but he had confirmed that she had been looking into his room the entire time. And even if she hadn't, she now knew which room was his. Later that night, he asked one of his housemates about her. The housemate told him that the woman had always been there, and that he should try his best to ignore her like the rest of them did. Garrett inquired further about her, but the guy genuinely didn't know anything, and said he was just repeating what someone had told him when he moved in. It didn't sit right with Garrett, so he asked around until he got some semblance of an answer. One of the seniors in the specific house she lived in told him that she was associated with the university and was a little kooky, but that she didn't have a history of violence or getting physical. Garrett asked why no one found that as strange as he did, and the senior told him that they really couldn't control who lived there, as that decision was up to the property manager. He wasn't fully satisfied with that answer, but there was nothing he could do, so he tried to just block her out of his mind, but then it got worse. One night, he walked out of his room and nearly ran into her. She was in the hallway, standing right in front of his door. He literally jumped back because she caught him so off guard. It was past midnight on like a Tuesday, so the house was mostly dead. She didn't say anything when she saw him. She barely even reacted. Instead, she just turned and walked away as if he were the one who had intruded on her. Garrett wouldn't go into every little detail, but there were several more occurrences like that one, where he caught her either snooping somewhere she had no business being or doing something she had no business doing. At some point, he lost his room key. All three houses had once been part of the same hotel, so all the rooms had personal locks and keys. It was a co-op, so most people just left their doors unlocked. But Garrett was someone who couldn't sleep comfortably knowing someone could just walk into his room, so losing his key was a big deal. Everyone had a spare, including him, but he was pissed because he'd have to go make a copy of the key. And that was an extra annoyance he couldn't afford at the time. A few nights later, he woke up randomly in the night. He wasn't sure why at first, but then he heard it. There was a soft bumping coming from his closet every 20 seconds or so. It sounded like something shifting behind the door, like something was moving inside of his closet. Garrett wasn't one to scare easily, and he was definitely not one to be helpless in a dangerous situation, so he was going to deal with this himself. He quietly got out of bed and took a deep breath. He slowly walked over to the closet, trying to keep his breathing under control. His heart was racing. In one fluid motion, he ripped the closet door open and screamed like a crazy person. Just as he expected, the woman was in there. She had one of his ties wrapped around her neck, and her eyes were wide open. She was holding a kitchen knife with her other hand. His scream must have startled her, because before he could react, she lunged at him with the knife outstretched. He screamed again, only this one wasn't pretend. It was a scream of pure fear. He wrestled her to the ground and was able to disarm her pretty easily, given how frail and small she was. That didn't make the situation any less terrifying, though. She kicked and fought and bit as he pinned her to the ground, screaming the whole time. He yelled for help, and he heard some doors slam, followed by some of his housemates running down the hall. His friend Lee immediately helped him immobilize the woman, and the two of them kept her pinned while someone else called the police. The rest of the night was a blur. The police got there quickly and arrested her on the spot. By that point, she had stopped screaming, but she refused to say anything either, which was extremely unsettling. The cops found his room key on her. Real big shocker there. A few weeks later, they got their answer about who she was. Apparently, she was the property manager's sister who he had been letting live there under the radar. She had severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her proper care, he had just thrown her into one of the unoccupied rooms. Garrett believed the property manager was eventually arrested for negligence and a slew of other things, and rightfully so. Garrett honestly blamed him so much more for what happened than her. If anything, he felt bad for her, but his pity wouldn't erase the fact that she had tried to kill him. He could have lost his life that night. He had no idea why she seemed so interested in him specifically, but he could only hope nothing like that ever happened to him again. He was graduating soon, and he was definitely going to miss college, but he didn't think he'd ever be able to look back on his time there without thinking about that night. The wrong neighbor. This happened to Sarah just a couple of weeks ago, and honestly, she was still running on a level of paranoia she didn't even know was possible. The short version was, she learned exactly how far some people would go when you asked them to turn down the noise. Sarah was fresh out of college and living on her own for the first time, which sounded great until she realized it meant she was living in a shitty area because that was all she could afford. The house was a dump, but the real price she paid was the neighbors. On one side, it was the usual, non-stop, blasting music at all hours. But the people on the other side, they were the creepiest Sarah had ever met in her life, bar none. It was two women next door. One was older, maybe in her 60s, and she was not friendly at all. She barely seemed to be all there herself, constantly looking at Sarah like she was an inconvenience. The other was a slightly younger woman who had some kind of severe mental disabilities. Sarah had no idea what the relationship was between the two of them, sister, daughter, caregiver, whatever. But the dynamic was disturbing. She would sit on her front porch in the evenings, trying to relax after work. and would constantly look over to see a scene unfolding in their yard. The older woman would be literally restraining the younger one, who'd be in the middle of a freakout episode. The younger woman would stand there, arms crossed tightly, rocking back and forth violently, just screaming and making these horrible, inhuman noises. Sometimes, she would look over at Sarah, point a trembling finger, and mumble incomprehensible, angry words at the older woman. It was unsettling enough that Sarah would often just go inside when it got too much. It made her skin crawl. On this particular night, 2 weeks ago, Sarah had to be up early for work. She was trying to crash early, but the house next door was a complete zoo. The younger woman was having a meltdown of epic proportions. Sarah could hear her screaming and thrashing, and the older woman was yelling in distress, trying to contain her. This went on for about an hour, and Sarah just hit her limit. She couldn't sleep through it. She got out of bed and, without thinking it through, marched over to their house. She pounded on the door. The older woman yanked it open and looked at her with pure venom, like, "What the hell do you want?" Sarah tried to be as polite as possible, forcing a calm tone. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I have to be up for work early. Could you please just try to keep the noise down a little?" In response, the woman just raised her eyebrows and tilted her head down, a clear look of annoyance and disgust washing over her face. Just then, the younger woman darted into the living room, spotting Sarah framed in the doorway. She started screaming, "How dare you? How dare you?" over and over again. The older woman quickly grabbed her and held her back from rushing the door. And then she didn't say a single word, she just slammed the door in Sarah's face. Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned. She walked back to her house feeling defeated, like she'd just antagonized two crazy people for nothing. But as she got back inside, she realized something. They had finally gone silent next door. The house was quiet. She was able to get some sleep. Sarah woke up feeling completely disoriented, like the night had flown by. She looked at the digital clock on her bedside table. 3 a.m. Relief washed over her. She had a few more hours. She dropped her head back onto the pillow. But before she could drift off, she thought she heard something. A sound from downstairs. It was faint, maybe just the house settling, but it was enough to stop her heart from resuming its normal rhythm. She got out of bed, creeping over to her door, just to make sure she wasn't hearing things. She stood there for a solid minute, listening into the silent house. Nothing. No sounds. Sarah told herself it was just stress from the earlier confrontation, went back to bed and closed her eyes. She woke up again, maybe 20 minutes later. The room was pitch black. She didn't know what woke her up this time, but the hair on the back of her neck was standing straight up. And then she heard it. A small, dry, snuffling sound coming from somewhere in the room. Panic seized her. Her mind immediately went to her phone on the bedside table. She needed a light. She needed to see. She fumbled for it in the dark, but when her fingers finally closed around the cold glass, she didn't dare turn the screen on. She held her breath, straining her eyes in the oppressive darkness, trying to find some sort of shadow, some figure that didn't belong. She looked at every corner of the room, every dark piece of furniture, and even though it was so dark, she couldn't see anything standing there. The snuffling sound came again, this time closer, more defined. Sarah knew exactly where it was coming from. She turned her gaze to the foot of her bed, the bed she was lying in. Right at the edge of the wooden bed frame, where the dark corner of the wall met the mattress, she saw a black circular object. It was slightly darker than the shadows around it. She took a shaky breath, finally pressing the power button on her phone. The screen flashed bright white, instantly illuminating the room. The black object was the top of a head, and the head belonged to the deranged woman from next door. She had been hunched over, silently watching Sarah sleep from the foot of her own bed, right next to her feet. When the harsh phone light hit her face, she threw her head back and screamed a terrible, raw, ear-splitting sound, like a creature exposed to the sun. Sarah screamed too, a gut-deep, terrified sound, scrambling backward off the bed. She clumsily sprinted for the door, her legs tangling in the sheets, and she tripped, falling halfway out into the hallway. She looked back, a split-second glance, and saw the woman lurching after her, her mouth still wide open in that insane scream. Sarah slammed her bedroom door shut and didn't stop running until she hit the bottom of the stairs. She immediately locked the door leading to the upstairs. Then she grabbed her phone and called the police, backing herself against the farthest wall. The woman was upstairs, pounding on the door and screaming things that were utterly incomprehensible, just a series of terrifying, guttural noises. When the cops showed up, they found her still up there, trying to tear the door off the hinges. Sarah explained that the woman lived next door and was severely mentally ill. While the officers were talking to her, the older woman from next door, the one who had slammed the door in Sarah's face, came over after hearing all the commotion. She spoke with the cops, pleading with them to let the younger woman go. They insisted they had to take her in, at least for the night, for a psych hold and for Sarah's safety. One of the officers asked Sarah if she wanted to press charges. As he asked, Sarah looked past him at the older woman. The woman was staring directly at her, and it was a stare of pure, distilled evil and hatred. It was the most malevolent look Sarah had ever received in her life. She told the officer she didn't want to press charges. She just wanted the woman gone. The hateful stare didn't change. The officers drove the ill woman away, and the older woman continued to stare at Sarah as she walked back to her house. 5 minutes later, Sarah watched her get into her own car and drive away, leaving the house completely empty. Here's the thing. Those two still lived next to Sarah. The older woman, the one who seemed perfectly sane enough to hold a grudge, made it crystal clear that she despised Sarah and blamed her for what happened. And the younger woman? She didn't just get loud. She broke into Sarah's house and stood over her while she slept. She wasn't just terrifying. She was genuinely dangerous. Sarah concluded that her caregiver was both negligent and furious at her. Sarah was seriously considering selling the house, losing money, and moving out. Because every night when she lay in bed, she wondered if she had locked that upstairs door, and if the older woman would finally snap and decide to help the younger one get back in